So now we want to install a Redux Thunk so that we can halt the dispatch in the action creator. Then return a function inside that action creator, and that function creates some kind of asynchronous task to go out and communicate with a JSON placeholder API. So let's first install a Redux Thunk. So inside the project directory, I will say npm install Redux Thunk. And right after that, I will say Axios, because we're going to be fetching some data from an outside API with the Axios function. All right, so now that that's installing, we can go ahead and use it inside of our store. So inside the index.js, this is where we set up our store using create store. And this is where we're going to need to apply some middleware. So remember, Redux Thunk is middleware, and we need to apply that to our store. So first of all, we're going to import Thunk from Redux Thunk. And I will say import Thunk from Redux Thunk, like so. And then what we need to do is apply middleware inside the store. And we do that as a second parameter inside the create store method. But first of all, we will need to import the apply middleware function. So to do that, we import it from Redux. So next to the create store, we'll import apply middleware, like so. So now we can use that function over here. So we'll say apply middleware in here. And this is a function in itself, and we want to apply Thunk as the middleware. So let's pass that in here. Okay, so now this function right here, apply middleware function, this could take in a list of middleware, and it turns it into a store enhancer. So we could add many different middlewares inside of here. I hear what you're thinking, and yes, we could also have many different store enhancers in here, like apply middleware. So by applying this Thunk middleware, this is now enhancing our store with extra functionality. Pretty cool. And that functionality is how we're going to be able to return a function inside of our action creators, which can then interact with an API. So let's set up a simple action creator, and we can quickly see how this works. So let's go to the card action.js file, which is going to contain all of our card actions. Underneath the delete card, we will create a new action creator. I will say export const fetch users, and this will be an arrow function. Now I have called action creator as fetch user because the purpose of fetch users is to make an API request. So inside of here, we have to return a function, and that function is going to dispatch the data that we're going to fetch from an API to the reducer. And again, this time we're going to return a function instead of the JavaScript object. So only with Redux Thunk are we able to return a JavaScript function, by the way. So I will say return, then create an arrow function, like so. So the first argument of this function is going to be the dispatch method, because we're going to dispatch an action to the reducer. And the action is going to contain type and payload as properties. So we are going to fetch a payload from JSON placeholder API. So let's go to the JSON API. So I'm going to open up a new browser tab, and I'll say JSON placeholder. And I'm going to click this link right here. It says JSON placeholder, type code. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit, and we're going to use this URL to fetch the data. But instead of to-dos, we're going to fetch this user's resources. And then that'll provide us 10 users for each request. All right. So let's copy this URL, just this part, because we're going to be using the users as an endpoint, not to-dos. And let's flip back to the code editor. So first, we should use the import Axios function to fetch data. Top of the file, I will say import Axios from Axios. So inside of here, I will say axios.get, open up parentheses, quotes, and then paste the URL that we copied. And then at the end of it, I will say users, because we want to get the users from the JSON API. Now, right after that, I'm going to use .then as my method because this is an asynchronous operation. So we should wait to resolve the request. So this .then method takes callback, and this callback will provide us the data that we fetch from the JSON API. So let's deconstruct the data here, like so. Now inside of here, we are going to dispatch an action to the reducer. I will say dispatch and open up the object, and this will be the action. And the action type is going to be fetch users, and that's what we're doing. And the payload is going to be data, and that we're going to fetch from the JSON API, this thing right here. All right. So that's how we create an action creator with asynchronous operations. So now let's go to the card component and connect this action to the reducer. So first of all, we should import that action. I'll just say fetch user right here. So then we need to map dispatch to props of our card component. And I'm going to say fetch user, and this will be our props name. And this is going to be a function that returns dispatch an action. And the action is going to be the fetch user, like so. So now the only thing that we need to do is call that function. So whenever we call that function, it's going to call this action creator right here, and then this action creator is going to make a request to an API and then return us the data. Then we are dispatching that data to the reducer. All right, so let's call this function. So I'm going to call it inside the component didMount lifecycle method. And I want to get data after the component mounted in DOM. All right, so now we can reach that data inside of our reducer. So let's go back to the reducer. So first of all, let's add the users property to our store state. Then inside of here, I will say case fetch users. And if the action type is fetch users, I'm going to return an object. And this will be our store state. Then inside of here, I will say .state. And this will give us all the properties inside the state object. Then I'm going to override users with whatever's coming in from the JSON API. And I will say users is equal to action.payload, like so. So now let's go to the card.js again and see the users that we fetched from JSON API. And inside the mapStateToProps function underneath the card, I will say users, and this is going to be equal to state.users, like so. Now we can reach the users that we fetched from an API inside of our component. Yeah. Now, before we show it on the browser, though, let's console log it out. I will say console log this .props.users right here. So let's save it and flip on back to the browser. And let's go to the card page. Okay, so we have an array of users right here. And inside of each object, we have a property, ID, user, and email. So each user has an ID, user, and an email property, right? So let's go to the car.js and print them on the browser. Let's comment out all this stuff. We're not going to be using these. So we're going to get the users from the props instead of these things. And we will map over the users, and each user will be the user. And then we will return JSX here. So let's cut all this and paste it here. Okay, list key is going to be user.id, and the name is user.name. Then inside of this p tag, let's remove this and say user.email, like so. Okay, so let's save all this and see it in the browser. All right, so now we have a user card that we fetch from the JSON API. Okay, so that is Redux Thunk. That seems perhaps a little bit confusing, but actually it's not. I mean, you just need to really get into some practice. So after getting used to the Redux terminology like Thunk and middleware and store, I know that you're going to be a lot more confident. And you'll see that it's very handy, and actually it gets pretty easy to use. So let's just sum it up quickly. The component is calling an action creator called fetch users, and that's happening inside of here. So inside the component didMount method, it's calling the component after the component is mounted on the DOM. It'll automatically call the fetch users action creator. Then Axios makes a request to the JSON API. So it's reaching out to the API, grabbing some data, and returning it. And then we are dispatching that data to the reducer right here. So usually, all action creators are expected to return JavaScript objects. But when we are using Redux Thunk, or in other words, when we want to execute some asynchronous action, we are going to be returning a function, because we need to invoke that function as a props inside the component to execute the API request. Yeah. Then we dispatch that action to the reducer with the property type and payload. We updated the store state, and in this case, the user's property inside the reducer. And then we reach that new updated state with map state to props function inside the component. All right. So again, the more you use dispatches and different components, the more you'll be using action creators or Redux Thunk or whatever. You're going to be a whole lot more confident, and you're going to really like using Redux. I promise, after using it, short period of time, it's going to be that piece of cake.